Welcome to my channel. Subscribe to the channel and listen to my stories every day. The first hint was small enough to ignore. Jenna, my wife of 15 years, had always been good at keeping things organized, managing her life with the practiced ease that comes with years of habit. But then, about a month ago, she started checking her phone more often. At first, I brushed it off. After all, we're all on our phones constantly these days, right? But there was something different about her, a kind of eagerness, almost a glow, that seemed out of place. One night, as she sat on the couch, her face lit up by the glow of her phone, I watched her from across the room. Her eyes darted around, lips pressed into a subtle smile, like she was sharing a private joke with someone. When I asked what she was laughing at, she looked up quickly, her smile vanishing. "Oh, it's just a meme from the girls at work," she replied, brushing me off with a wave of her hand. "Nothing interesting." She slipped her phone back into her pocket, and her gaze went blank, as if the switch between screens had turned her back into the wife I knew. But a question lingered in the back of my mind, one I couldn't shake. The days that followed offered no relief. The laughter continued, the quick glances at her phone that she tried, and failed, to hide. Her usual warmth felt like a show now, like she was putting on a mask every time I entered the room. I told myself I was being paranoid. 15 years, I thought. We'd been through so much together, our careers, the years of building up the house, the long hours I put in to make sure she had everything she wanted. The idea that anything could come between us seemed ridiculous, something that happened to other people. Then came the night that changed everything. Jenna had gone to bed early, claiming she had a headache. I was up late, finishing a report I had to submit the next morning. Around midnight, I decided to call it a night. As I passed our bedroom, I saw her phone lying on the dresser. It lit up, casting a soft light that filled the room for just a second. I glanced at it, just out of habit, and there it was. A message from someone named Dave, work, a name that wasn't in any of the stories Jenna had ever told me about her office. My heartbeat quickened as I stood there, staring at the phone. Was this just a colleague texting her at an odd hour? I told myself it was, but the gnawing feeling in my gut grew stronger, like a relentless itch. I left the room and went to bed, but my mind raced. The next day, I couldn't get the name out of my head. I went through every scenario. Maybe Dave was a harmless friend, someone who didn't know that midnight wasn't an appropriate time to text a married woman. Or maybe there was something darker. The doubt twisted inside me, tightening its grip as I lay awake beside her. I wanted to ignore it, but over the next few days, Jenna's behavior only grew more suspicious. She'd smile at her phone during dinner, quickly swipe to close the screen when she noticed me looking. Her laughter had an edge to it now, a kind of secrecy. Then, on one of her so-called late nights, when she claimed she was staying late to finish a project, I had enough. That night, I went through her phone records. My hands shook as I scanned through each entry, my stomach a knot of dread and anger. There it was, call after call, text after text, all to the same number. Dave, work. But it wasn't her work number, I was sure of it. I had her company's directory in my email, and his number didn't match any of the office lines. A sickening realization began to sink in. This wasn't just paranoia. There was something real here, something hidden. And it was getting harder to pretend I didn't see it. But I wasn't going to confront her without proof. I needed to be sure, to know beyond any doubt that what I suspected was true. I wanted something concrete, something I could hold in my hands. That's when I decided to hire a private investigator. Just the idea of it felt ridiculous, like I was part of some third-rate crime drama. But I was past the point of caring. I wanted answers, even if it meant shattering every image I had of our marriage. 2 days later, I met with a man named Carson in a quiet, out-of-the-way coffee shop. He was a no-nonsense type, the kind you'd expect to see tailing someone in a dark trench coat and sunglasses. Carson listened, his face expressionless as I described my suspicions. He asked me a few questions, jotting down notes in a small, well-worn notebook. When he finally looked up, his eyes were hard. "I'll get you what you need," he said simply, like he'd heard it all before. He assured me it would be discreet, that I wouldn't have to worry about Jenna finding out. I paid him a retainer, the same amount I'd planned to use for our next vacation, and left the cafe feeling hollow, like a piece of me had been left behind. The waiting was the worst part. I carried on with life, going to work, having dinners with Jenna, acting like everything was fine. But each time I looked at her, I wondered what secrets lay behind that familiar smile. A week passed, then another, and each day felt like a slow drip of poison. I wanted answers, but I dreaded them at the same time. I knew that once the truth was out, there would be no going back. Finally, 2 weeks later, Carson called. He sounded calm, professional. "I've got what you were looking for," he said. "Do you want to meet?" I agreed, my pulse racing. That evening, I sat across from him at the same coffee shop, and he handed me a manila envelope, its weight heavier than I'd expected. "I'm sorry," he said quietly, his face softening for the first time since we'd met. "You should prepare yourself. It's clear." I nodded, thanked him, and left without opening the envelope. As I drove home, I gripped the steering wheel, feeling like I was teetering on the edge of a cliff. When I got home, Jenna was out, supposedly meeting up with friends for dinner. I sat down at the kitchen table, the envelope in front of me. My hands were steady as I tore it open, but inside, I was a storm. Inside were photos, a few handwritten notes, a log of the places Jenna had visited over the past 2 weeks. There she was, laughing, touching his arm, looking at him with a softness she hadn't shown me in years. And him, Dave, tall, dark-haired, smug in a way that made my blood boil. The photos showed them at a bar, then at a small, dimly lit restaurant. In one photo, they leaned in close, lips inches apart. In another, they walked hand in hand down the street, heads bent close, like they were the only two people in the world. The reality hit me like a punch to the gut. This wasn't just a mistake, a momentary lapse. This was a lie, woven carefully into the fabric of our life. I sat there for what felt like hours, staring at the photos, feeling the betrayal seep into every corner of my mind. When Jenna came home later that night, I was in bed, feigning sleep. I didn't trust myself to speak, didn't want to give away that I knew. I heard her footsteps in the hallway, her soft, familiar voice as she hummed to herself. She slid into bed beside me, and I felt the weight of her betrayal settle heavily between us. But this wasn't over. Not yet. I wasn't going to let her walk away from this without facing the consequences. The days that followed were excruciating. Every time I looked at Jenna, I saw those images from the envelope, the way she looked at him, laughed with him, touched him. Each moment we spent together felt like a charade, a grotesque performance. I was going through the motions, playing the part of the oblivious husband, while underneath, something inside me burned. She went on as if nothing had changed, laughing over breakfast, texting at odd hours, giving me the same forced smile whenever she looked up from her phone. It was as if she believed she could carry on this double life without a hitch, without ever paying for the lies she'd woven so carefully into our life. But now, knowing what I knew, I couldn't just ignore it. The anger I felt was real, raw, and unrelenting. I was certain of one thing: she had to be confronted, but it wasn't going to be a dramatic scene. I wouldn't give her the satisfaction of thinking she could manipulate her way out of it. No, I would handle this with the same calculation she'd used to keep her secret affair going. If she had betrayed me with careful, quiet deceit, I would respond in kind. I spent the next few days preparing, calling my lawyer, making inquiries about separating our finances, and ensuring that every important document, property deeds, account statements, insurance policies, was secure. I wasn't just ending our marriage, I was erasing every trace of her from my life. She wouldn't know what hit her. One morning, as she sipped her coffee and read the paper, she mentioned offhandedly that she'd be working late again that night. She said it casually, like it was just another long day at the office, but I could see the flicker of excitement in her eyes, a hint of something I'd once thought was reserved for me. The rage boiled beneath the surface, but I stayed calm, forcing a nod and a half-smile. "Don't overdo it," I said, keeping my voice neutral. "You work too hard." She looked at me, and for a second, I saw something in her eyes, maybe a flash of guilt or a quick pang of realization that I was beginning to notice her growing absences. But she brushed it off with a laugh and went back to her coffee. That evening, after she left, I went to my office and unlocked the drawer where I'd stored the envelope from Carson. I spread the photos on my desk, studying each one carefully, feeling a strange, cold calm settle over me. It was surreal, this man, this stranger, had become the center of her world, all while she sat across from me each night, pretending everything was fine. By the time she came home, I had already gone to bed, leaving the house dimly lit. I heard her come in quietly, almost cautiously, as if she was sneaking back into a life she'd forgotten. She took extra care not to wake me, slipping into bed with the careful movements of someone who had spent the evening in someone else's arms. I lay still, feigning sleep, feeling the tension between us like a taut wire. The next morning, I acted as if nothing had happened. I got ready for work, kissed her cheek, a small, distant kiss that felt more like a formality than anything else, and left. But the second I was out of sight, I went to meet my lawyer. We spent hours going over the details, making sure that every loose end was tied up, that there would be no surprises when the day finally came. The day I chose to end it all was a Friday. I planned it meticulously, down to the smallest detail, making sure that everything was in place. I wanted her to understand the depth of her betrayal and to feel the consequences in every corner of her life. I arranged for us to meet at her favorite restaurant that night. It was the place where we'd celebrated countless anniversaries, where we'd laughed over shared meals, and where she'd once told me she wanted to grow old with me. Now, it would be the place where our marriage would come to an end. As I waited for her to arrive, I sat alone at a small table by the window, the envelope from Carson resting on the table beside me. I watched the couples around me, laughing, sharing meals, blissfully unaware of the storm brewing just a few feet away. I wondered if any of them had ever been in my position, sitting across from someone they loved, knowing that everything they thought was real had been a lie. When she finally walked in, she looked around for a moment before spotting me. Her face lit up with a smile, and for a brief moment, I saw the woman I'd fallen in love with all those years ago. She approached the table, her movements graceful and confident, as if she had nothing to hide. "Hey, you," she said, sliding into the seat across from me. "What's the special occasion?" I forced a smile, trying to mask the anger simmering beneath the surface. "Just thought it'd be nice to do something special," I said. "We haven't been here in a while." She looked pleased, as if she believed she'd managed to keep everything under control, that her little secret was safe. But I could see the faint lines of tension around her eyes, the flicker of nerves that she tried so hard to conceal. As we ordered drinks and made small talk, I watched her carefully, waiting for the right moment. She laughed at my jokes, reached for my hand across the table, as if she could erase the months of betrayal with a simple touch. But every gesture felt hollow, every smile forced. I could feel the weight of her lies pressing down on us, suffocating any trace of the love we'd once shared. When the drinks arrived, I lifted my glass, smiling as I made a toast. "To 15 years, I said, my voice steady. "And to the truth." She raised her glass, but her smile faltered, as if she sensed something lurking beneath my words. She hesitated, her eyes flicking to the envelope on the table. "What's that?" she asked, nodding toward the envelope. I met her gaze, feeling the tension build between us like a live wire. "It's something I think you should see," I replied, pushing the envelope across the table. She took it hesitantly, her hands trembling slightly as she opened it. Her eyes widened as she saw the photos, the shock and horror playing on her face. She flipped through each one, her face paling as the reality of her betrayal sank in. She looked up at me, her eyes wide with fear and disbelief. I can explain," she stammered, her voice barely a whisper. I leaned back, feeling a strange, calm satisfaction wash over me. "I don't need your explanations, Jenna. I've seen enough." Her mouth opened, but no words came out. She looked at me, her face crumbling as she realized the gravity of the situation. For the first time, I saw the mask slip, saw the raw fear in her eyes as she faced the consequences of her actions. "Please," she whispered, reaching across the table, her hand trembling. "Please, let me explain. It wasn't what you think." I let her words hang in the air, watching as she struggled to find something, anything, that could undo the damage she'd done. But there was nothing she could say, no excuse that could erase the betrayal. "I trusted you," I said quietly, my voice steady but cold. "I trusted you, and you threw it all away." Tears filled her eyes, and she tried to take my hand, but I pulled away, the finality of it sinking in. This was the end. There was no going back, no forgiveness that could patch the shattered pieces of our life. "Consider this our last dinner," I said, standing up and leaving a few bills on the table. "I hope he was worth it." Without another word, I turned and walked out of the restaurant, leaving her alone with her guilt, her lies, and the wreckage of everything we'd once shared. As I stepped out into the night, a weight lifted from my shoulders, and for the first time in months, I felt free. In the days that followed, a strange quiet filled the house. Jenna hadn't called or messaged, and I didn't expect her to. Our last encounter had been enough for both of us. After our confrontation at the restaurant, I had gone home, packed a bag, and left, not looking back. I checked into a small hotel on the edge of town, somewhere anonymous and simple, just what I needed. By Monday, the legal proceedings were already set in motion. The lawyer I'd hired was efficient, direct. We worked through every detail as if we were running a business deal, not dismantling a marriage. I had her boxed out of everything, the accounts were split, the property legally partitioned. It was almost surgical, how quickly it was happening. Meanwhile, Jenna was left scrambling. She tried calling a few times, leaving voicemails that ranged from pleading to angry to desolate. I didn't answer. I wanted her to feel the consequences without giving her the satisfaction of hearing my voice. The messages started with apologies, shallow ones, stumbling excuses that only made me feel more justified. As the days went on, the apologies turned desperate. It was a week later that I found myself back at the house. I wasn't sure if she'd be there, but it didn't matter. I had a few things to pick up, items that were left behind in the rush of leaving. As I stepped into the familiar entryway, the silence hit me, a reminder of the life we'd once built together. The walls were covered with photos, frozen smiles from family trips, holidays, and birthdays, all relics of a happiness that had slipped through my fingers without me even noticing. As I walked through the house, I felt a mix of anger and relief. The anger was still there, simmering, but it was lighter now, fading into something else, maybe detachment. I moved from room to room, taking down a few personal items, the things I'd decided to keep for myself. The life I'd shared with Jenna was now in boxes, a collection of memories that felt more like scenes from a movie than something I'd actually lived. In our bedroom, I paused, taking in the space that had once felt like the heart of our home. The bed was perfectly made, her touch evident in the way the pillows were fluffed just so, the sheets smoothed without a crease. I walked over to the dresser and pulled open the drawers, checking for anything I'd left behind. Among the familiar things, a small, worn notebook caught my eye. I hadn't seen it in years. It was a journal, one she'd kept when we were first married. I thumbed through it, seeing her handwriting fill the pages with notes from our early days, little things about our first apartment, our first trip to the coast, even the night we decided to start trying for a family. There were small, intimate notes scattered through it, things I'd never known she'd written down. They were tokens of a time when things had been simpler, clearer, before the years had weathered us into strangers. But as I reached the end of the journal, I saw entries that were more recent, their tone different. She'd written about feeling lost, disconnected, about the distance that had started to build between us. There were entries about her longing for excitement, for a life that didn't feel confined by routine. And then, near the very end, she'd written about him. Dave wasn't mentioned by name, but the references were clear. There were musings about a new feeling, a spark that she hadn't felt in years. Reading her words, I felt the sting of betrayal all over again, but there was something else there too, a recognition that maybe we'd both let things fall apart in our own ways. I closed the journal, feeling a strange mix of anger and clarity. It was clear she'd been searching for something outside of our marriage that she felt she couldn't find within it. I put the journal back where I found it, as if by doing so, I could leave her thoughts, her choices, where they belonged, in the past. As I packed up my things and left, I felt a sense of closure beginning to settle in, like the loose ends were finally being tied. I took one last look around, letting the weight of the house, the memories, fade behind me. I was ready to move on. Over the next few weeks, I began to rebuild my life. I rented an apartment in a part of town I'd never spent much time in, a small place with just enough space for me and the few things I'd taken from the house. It felt like starting fresh, like a clean slate. I threw myself into work, took on new projects, kept busy. In the evenings, I'd walk around the neighborhood, getting lost in the city, feeling the anonymity of a new life settle around me like a blanket. Jenna tried to reach out a few more times. Her messages had shifted from anger to desperation. She begged for a chance to explain, to talk. But there was nothing to say. I had seen all I needed, heard enough of her excuses. I let her calls go to voicemail, her messages piling up in my inbox, untouched. One night, I came home to find an envelope slipped under my apartment door. I recognized her handwriting immediately. It was thick with multiple pages, her writing scrawled across each one in a messy, frantic script. I didn't want to open it, didn't want to read the apologies and excuses that I knew were inside. But curiosity got the better of me, and I found myself sitting on the edge of my bed, tearing it open. Her letter started with an apology, her words tumbling over themselves in her rush to explain. She wrote about the loneliness she'd felt, about the boredom that had crept into her life, the feeling that everything had become a series of routines. She admitted she'd been selfish, that she'd sought validation outside our marriage without considering the consequences. But then, the letter took a turn I didn't expect. She wrote about how, even after everything, she missed me. She missed the life we built, the stability, the quiet love that had grown between us over the years. She confessed that she'd ended things with Dave, that whatever thrill she'd thought she'd found with him had been a shallow distraction from what really mattered. Her words turned pleading, begging me to consider coming back, to give us, a second chance. As I read, a wave of conflicting emotions swept over me. Part of me wanted to tear the letter up, to leave her words unread, to dismiss her plea as too little, too late. But another part of me, a smaller, quieter part, remembered the good years, the love that had once felt unbreakable. I thought about the life we'd built together, the way we'd shared everything, from the smallest details to our biggest dreams. I sat there for a long time, the letter crumpled in my hands, feeling the weight of her words. Could I let go of the anger, the betrayal? Could I forgive her, try to rebuild what we'd lost? It was tempting, the thought of putting the pieces back together, of finding a way to move past the hurt and betrayal. But then, I remembered the photos, the lies, the months she'd spent with someone else while pretending everything was fine between us. I remembered the weight of the deceit, the way she'd shattered the trust I'd once thought was unbreakable. And in that moment, I knew the answer. I took the letter and placed it back in the envelope, then walked out to the balcony. The night was cold, the air crisp and sharp as I held the letter over the railing, letting the wind pull at it, trying to decide. Finally, I let it slip from my fingers, watched as the envelope drifted down into the darkness below, carried away by the breeze. As I watched it disappear, a sense of finality settled over me, a quiet acceptance that this was the end. There would be no second chances, no going back. Jenna had made her choices, and I had made mine. The life we'd shared, the love we'd once had, it was all in the past now, a chapter closed. I turned back into my apartment, feeling lighter, as if a weight had finally been lifted. The hurt would linger, I knew that much. But with each step forward, each day that passed, the anger and bitterness would fade, replaced by a new kind of peace. I was free to move on, to build a life that was mine alone, untethered from the betrayal that had once consumed me. As I closed the door behind me, I felt a quiet resolve take hold, a determination to face the future without looking back. I was ready to start again, to embrace the unknown, whatever it might bring. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like I could finally breathe. Months passed, and life took on a quiet rhythm that I began to cherish. I threw myself into work, reconnected with old friends, and even took up photography, something I'd always wanted to try but never seemed to have the time for. The pain of Jenna's betrayal dulled slowly, like a scar fading over time. It was still there, but I felt like I could move forward without being dragged back by memories of what she'd done. One evening, after a long day at work, I stopped by a new coffee shop that had opened up near my apartment. It was small, cozy, the kind of place that felt warm even in the dead of winter. I ordered a coffee, pulled out my phone, and started scrolling through emails. As I sat, a familiar voice pulled me out of my thoughts. "Thomas?" I looked up, my heart catching in my throat. It was Jenna. She looked different, smaller somehow, as if the weight of everything had finally taken its toll. She wore no makeup, her hair was pulled back, and she held a worn, slightly creased notebook in her hands. I recognized it instantly, the same journal I'd found in our bedroom all those months ago. For a moment, we just stared at each other, caught in the gravity of everything left unspoken. Finally, she cleared her throat, her voice barely above a whisper. "Do you mind if I sit?" I gestured to the chair opposite me, my mind still reeling from the shock. She lowered herself into the chair, clutching the journal tightly, as if it were the only thing holding her together. I didn't think I'd run into you here," she started, her voice unsteady. "I've been meaning to reach out, but, well, I didn't think you'd want to hear from me." I didn't say anything, just watched her, waiting to see where this was going. She shifted in her seat, glancing down at the journal, then back up at me. "I know I have no right to ask for anything," she said, her voice cracking. "But I want to tell you the truth. Not the version I gave you before. The real truth." I felt a pang of anger rise up, but I pushed it down. "The truth?" I asked, my tone flat. "Go ahead." She opened the journal, flipping through pages I hadn't read, her hands trembling. She took a deep breath and began, her words spilling out in a rushed confession. "When it started with Dave, I told myself it was just, I don't know, something to fill the emptiness I felt. I know that's a terrible excuse. But the truth is, it wasn't just boredom or loneliness." She paused, closing her eyes for a moment, gathering herself. I leaned forward, curiosity mixed with a bitterness I couldn't shake. "What was it, then?" She swallowed, her eyes misty. "I was trying to punish you," she said, the words hitting me like a punch to the gut. "For things you didn't even know about." "Punish me?" I repeated, disbelief coloring my voice. "What are you talking about?" She took a shuddering breath, her hands clutching the journal even tighter. "Do you remember that business trip you took 3 years ago? The one to Chicago?" I nodded slowly. "Yes, what about it?" She looked down, her face filled with a mixture of shame and regret. "While you were gone, I found something." It was a note, tucked away in one of your work folders. A love note. My heart dropped. What? That's impossible. I never. It was signed by someone named Claire, she interrupted, her voice barely a whisper. It was everything, Thomas. You said you missed her, that you were counting the days until you'd see her again. I stared at her, my mind racing. Jenna, I never, there was no Claire. She shook her head, her face pale. I thought it was real, Thomas. I thought you'd been hiding an affair from me all this time. So I kept it to myself, waited for you to confess, to slip up, but you never did. And then. I guess I couldn't stand it anymore. I thought if I did the same thing, it would somehow even things out. Her voice broke, and she looked down, ashamed. I thought I was justified. I thought that I deserved the same freedom. But I was wrong. I sat there, stunned, my mind scrambling to piece together what she'd just said. Jenna, I've never had an affair. There was no Claire. I don't know what you found, but it wasn't from me. She looked up, confusion clouding her eyes. But. I saw it. I read it, Thomas. It was your handwriting. I thought back, trying to remember anything that could explain it. Suddenly, it hit me. The note. Claire, my colleague at work. I had been helping her through a rough time, nothing romantic. I had written a note of encouragement when she was going through a divorce, but it was nothing more than a friendly gesture. I had completely forgotten about it, not realizing it had fallen into the wrong hands. It was a note for a colleague, I said, the truth sinking in. She was going through a divorce, and I was just, trying to be kind. I never imagined you'd find it and think. Jenna, I never cheated on you. The color drained from her face, and she slumped back in her chair, a strangled sob escaping her lips. Oh my God, she whispered, her voice breaking. I ruined everything because of a misunderstanding. The weight of her words hung between us, heavy and irreversible. She looked at me, her eyes full of regret, and in that moment, I saw how deeply her choice had scarred us both. I'm so sorry, she whispered, her face streaked with tears. If I'd known, if I'd just asked. I was so convinced that you'd betrayed me that I didn't even think to talk to you about it. I looked at her, feeling a surge of emotions I couldn't quite process. Anger, pity, sadness, they all mingled together, creating a cocktail of feelings that left me reeling. This was the truth she had wanted to tell me, the confession that had come too late. After a long silence, I spoke, my voice soft but firm. Jenna, it doesn't change what happened. What you did. She nodded, her face etched with sorrow. I know. And I don't expect forgiveness. I don't deserve it. But. I just needed you to know. We sat there in silence, the weight of everything that had happened pressing down on us. I could see that she was broken, that she carried the full burden of her choices, but it didn't lessen the pain she had caused. After a few moments I stood, signaling that our conversation was over. She looked up, her eyes pleading, but I couldn't offer her the closure she wanted. She had destroyed us because of a single moment of doubt, and there was no going back. As I walked out of the coffee shop, I felt a strange sense of finality. The past, with all its wounds and regrets, was now fully behind me. I had the truth, but it brought no solace, only a lesson in the consequences of silence and mistrust. I turned the corner and let the cool evening air fill my lungs, feeling as though a heavy weight had finally been lifted. I was free, and for the first time, I realized that freedom was all I had ever truly wanted.